morning. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion today on the theoretical basis of human rights. And welcome also to those of you who are joining us through the recording on the OU website. Today, we hope to explore some broad topics in the area of rights theory, including the universality of human rights language, the notion of inherent dignity, and balancing human rights with responsibilities. So perhaps we could begin with some brief introductions. So I'll begin by asking the discussants, and then Jessica and I will introduce ourselves briefly. So Professor Morita, would you like to begin with introducing yourselves? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Firstly, really, thank you very much for inviting me to this really wonderful opportunities to deepen our understanding in this intercultural understanding about religion and also human rights. In fact, we started our conversations in back to our last year's in our online conference hosted by National University of Vietnam. So our conversation started in Vietnam, and I'm now really glad to see it happening in the UK and Japan and around the globe. And my major kind of research topic is in multiple justifications, philosophical foundations of human rights in these multicultural societies. And quite recently, my interest also shifted to what human rights will look like after this digital transformation in the era. So meaning that how this human rights concept itself may change, may transform after this we just pass through this huge the social and this spiritual probably transformations. So that's more or less what I'm working on in the last 20 plus years. And I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Maria Nita, would you like to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am a lecturer in religious studies at the Open University. And I'm also the teaching lab lead for our new research center, which is Global Challenges and Social Justice. So the topic of this discussion is really, I'm really interested in it from the point of view of justice. I have been looking, my research looks at climate activism, and climate justice is a huge topic. And of course, this distinction between human rights and non-human rights, is one that is also implicit in my work, because many of the, in climate activism, there is almost a separation, let's say, between activists that campaign for, the necessary changes to be made for, to protect us from the effects of climate change from the point of view of human rights. And there are those who are obviously thinking about non-human rights and, kind of other notions of, ecocide and so on. So, that's one point that intersects the discussion that we're having today. I'm also interested in this idea of the sacred. Of course, I'm religious studies, so this kind of the theoretical concepts that we are discussing today are of interest to me as well. The idea of the sacred and this idea of secular society and whether it can protect human rights. Stop here.
Thank you very much. And perhaps I'll hand over to you, Jessica, for an introduction.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, so I am director of the project on interdisciplinary law and religion studies at the Open University Law School, and I work as a law lecturer at the Open University Law School. I have some professional training as well as a solicitor and barrister, so I look to the practical side of law as well as the theoretical side. I think sometimes we need that lens into how the law is working on the ground. But I also, in my research, look at law and theology, so how we can understand the law from a theological perspective, and particularly the idea of multivalent approaches to law creation and law adjudication. The right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, of course, protects all religions and systems of thought and conscience. And in order to protect that very freedom, the freedom to orientate oneself around a particular ethical framework, we have to then build towards consensus in society. So what interests me is how we create those minimal rules for particular societies, for particular nation states, and then how we do that internationally, where our backgrounds are so diverse, and our theological and conscience-based consensus has to accommodate those different approaches, but still come to an agreement on what our legal norms are and how we interact at international and national levels. So I'm delighted to be in dialogue with Maria and Akihiko. It's a real privilege to be here with you. And thank you so much, Caroline, for hosting us and keeping us in order.
My pleasure, thank you. And just to give a brief introduction of myself, so my name is Dr. Caroline Roberts. I've had a long-standing interest in human rights. I'm currently an associate lecturer at the Oxford Brookes University and a consultant focusing on freedom of religion or belief. I'm currently writing a monograph for Cambridge University Press entitled Freedom of Religion or Belief and the European Convention on Human Rights. So that's a short introduction from me. So perhaps we'll begin with the discussion. So Jessica has kindly circulated some questions, which we will be hoping to explore during this session. So perhaps we'll begin with the broad topic of universality of rights and human rights language. So Rowan Williams suggests that it's essential that in an age that's often simultaneously sentimental, utilitarian and impatient, we do not allow the language of rights to wander too far from its roots in an acknowledgement of the sacred. However, for Helena Kennedy, she suggests that human rights provide us with a new language for discussing our relationships with each other and the rest of the world. It offers a language that belongs neither to the left nor the right because it's non-ideological and can speak to all the peoples of the world, irrespective of religious belief or worldview, because it is avowedly secular. So perhaps we'll start with the question of whether theologies inform human rights, and does an approach such as that of Rowan Williams, which emphasizes the theological ancestry of human rights, particularly the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, does that support or undermine the notion of universality of human rights? So I'll open that question to you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions, and also this setting this framework of our conversations. Firstly, just I want to make quite a small comment. Now you are talking about secular and also religious, but both concept is very much contestable, and also could be many different meanings depending on this each kind of culture and each kind of a context. And in this sense, I think it's really nice in recalling what Jack Moulton mentioned in well, I think half a century ago. So he said, we can really get in a consensus about what we need as a practical norm, in a legal norm, in a sense. But at the same time, we should admit that there are many different justifications which are not quite compatible with each other. And that this situation still continue, of course, still exist, or probably become much more visible in last 1 or 2 decades. So my point is, if we talk about secular and religious, then we must firstly identify in which context we are talking about. Yes, it's a Western, this European context, this secular completely meanings that are separate from the something transcendental, from some religious. And the religious part must be within in an internal kind of inner world, and it shouldn't be affecting this public debate or political debate. That's more or less in a common understanding. But it's not the case. So not only in a, let's say in the Islamic world, we can see in a much more kind of intimate kind of relationship and a much more impact of religious discourse, even on the public in this debate and the decision making, and of course in their legal systems. But it's not only the matter of the Islamic world and my world in East Asia. This firstly, the concept of religion seems to me quite different from what you have in the West. So, firstly, this definition of the concept is very much decides in how we can really discuss and communicate and conduct a dialogue about this topic. That's my first comment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maria, did you want to come in next?
Yes, it's a really, normally you have a kind of almost interior, well, or a position that you try to then defend, but it is one of those issues where I really feel that, I'm not sure if I agree with people like Charles Taylor, for instance, who would say that a secular society can protect the rights of minorities, and that's we don't need this reference to the sacred anymore, because we already have. And I suppose my understanding is that this is, this is the suggestion that's being made as well through this language of human rights, that can, we no longer need this reference to the sacred. And although I would like to, it's a very, I kind of like this proposition somehow. It's enticing. I'd like to believe that that's the case. But somehow I don't. I don't think that, and despite the fact that, I'm not religious myself, and, I understand that, it's important to have that, that kind of neutral, in a way, language. It doesn't seem to me that, we've arrived at a place where we really have, a kind of framework in which to protect, human and non-human rights. And, I think that, in my own research with climate activism, I can see that, secular, let's say, or, people who are not identifying as religious activists are in fact drawing on, on religious language, even religious practices, in their activism. So, like, I think very much like Akihiko said, this distinction is very blurry between the secular and the sacred anyway. I think it's something that requires a lot of thinking. And then, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. I'd like to, hope that I'd like to perhaps have a position or affirm a position at the end of the discussion. As it stands, I'm really, not convinced by this argument that the language of human rights can ensure that protection that that we need without reference to sacred.
I think we've all identified a point where we would agree here, in the sense that hinges around the meaning of secular, what we mean by secular and what we mean by neutral, and that potentially that pluralism is important as a principle to protect. So whether that's in a Western liberal democracy or in other types of forms of governance, it's something essential to our interaction as human beings, that we have this ability to form ethical frameworks to govern our interactions with each other. And it's a very fine balance, I think, sometimes for any government, either international governance system or national government, that we establish common rules, but we establish enough freedom for individuals to flourish, but also individuals to flourish in community. And I think this is really where Rowan Williams picks up the issue around rights and focuses on Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which does call to mind and call to the attention, if you like, of legislators, international and national, that rights aren't just about the individual, they are about a community, and that's how we flourish, that's about our identity, and that's who we are. We aren't who we are in isolation. And he has this just this beautifully eloquent phrase where he says, you know, human rights are about holding others in loving attention. And to me, that is the essence of rights. And legally, we perceive rights as claim rights towards others. So it's my right for this and my right for that. And he, if you like, turns it on his head and he says, actually, rights are about holding others in loving attention so that we are considering others. And of course, that there's then a broader network where we all live in this interrelationship. But within theological approaches to rights, there is, and certainly within a Christian theological approach to rights, there is this idea of freedom, not only freedom to choose for a religion, but freedom to choose against a religion. And the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, of course, protects all that. And what I think what's most problematic, and if we look at Rowan Williams' approach and Kennedy's approach, is this idea that secularism, as Akihiko says, is a contested concept now, both actually I think within the West and outside Western liberal democracy. And it's become contested around whether secularism means the protection of pluralism, even if government isn't necessarily having one theological approach, if you like. It isn't necessarily a Christian government, it isn't necessarily a Muslim government or whatever. To a certain extent, historically, secularism has protected pluralism in society. And what we're seeing now is secularism moving into neutrality. This idea that it's possible to be completely neutral. And I find that a difficult position to support, as it were, because I think even if we're claiming to be neutral, we have to form our rules on some ethical basis or other. So actually then humankind is becoming the reference point for the formulation of the ethical or moral basis for our laws and for our interactions. Now, we're told, for example, by the Pew Research Centre that over 80% of the globe adheres to some form of religion. And if we have governments adhering to the concept of neutrality and forming laws in that way, and the rest of the population, if you like, it is a mass generalization, but the rest of the global population orientating their lives around different types of frameworks stemming from their ethical beliefs, then we're in a problem. We get this widening gap between the governance structures and people living their daily lives, which can then just get larger and larger and cause real problems, potentially ending up in some violent disruptions. So I think even where we don't live within a democracy necessarily, whatever type of system we live within, the governing authorities are either going to need some form of force, or they have to have some mechanism for understanding and hearing the ethical frameworks that govern people's lives. And the building of norms within society has to come from that meeting of minds, as it were. Obviously, governance and governments have a bigger view to the international stage, to national concerns, and a people necessarily has to rely on its government for that. But by the same token, the governance structures are in place for the benefit of and to protect the flourishing of the people. So I think I'm far more for Rowan Williams's approach, in that we must account for ethical frameworks of those within either a global community or a national community, and that necessarily would need to include theological approaches.
Mhm.
Yes, and just to, just a small thought to what you're saying there, I really like this idea of kind of considering the rights of the, individual within their community, and, that link with their community. I think it's a more ecological way of thinking, and, it's almost not only the human community, but the non-human community, because if we are exploiting, their environments, then we are obviously not respecting their human rights, and it's not their direct rights, perhaps, but, the rights of future generations of that community. So, it's kind of, it almost, it fits in, I think, into this more ecological thinking, about us as individuals and, our relationships with our human and non-human communities and environments. So from that point of view, I think, it's also an important consideration to be made. And of course, religious traditions often, have, like you said, an ethical framework around that relationship with our environment, with, non-human others and so on. So it's very important to take that into consideration as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Quite thought-provoking this comments and in this ideas. So probably I have a couple well, I think I have a couple of ideas and probably small thoughts inspired by your this dialogue. One is this. I think Professor Gales mentioned that in holding others and also loving others is in essence what the human rights really trying to realize. Also, what human rights is all about. So that's I fully agree. And in these connections, I think Lord Williams referred to this cultural others. So meaning that we shouldn't jump into the conclusion that what God looks like in our perspective shouldn't be imposed to our cultural others. So meaning that first he suggested we must listen to others and try to understand. Then afterwards, maybe we can find out some kind of overlapping, so-called overlapping horizon for making it mutual understanding possible. That's one thing quite important. And so I think at this moment, in this contemporary world, probably most of the people, they agree that human rights is very important, must be respected. The question is, this human, definition of human, to which extent it's really cover everybody, or it's sometimes differentiated according to this our understanding of others. And that's, I think, in a root cause of some this conflict or some tensions between different countries or different ethnic groups. So that's one thing we must keep in mind. And also relating to this ecological thinkings, that's something I discussed with Professor Gale several times. So meaning that whether human rights or rights in our language can be extended beyond in human communities. So, and I think we should, because now we can see several dialogue about this rights of natural entity like river in a weather, and some countries like Bangladesh, I think New Zealand, and probably perhaps Ecuador, some country, it's already they acknowledged and recognized the rights of the rights of rivers, and also some the most advanced in front lines of technologies, artificial intelligence. In a whether artificial intelligence has some right or quasi-human rights like a human is huge in huge controversies in its ongoing discussions. And then we must also provide certain kind of framework or probably a certain justifications in whether or not AI has some kind of rights. So in this sense, in this concept of human rights also must be re-examined. And probably I'm from a non-Western region. So just I want to share one more quite interesting, probably a thought-provoking examples. Quite recently, I happened to come across the article written by Chinese scholar philosophers. He traced the history of this, the history of this the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and his conclusion is deciding the concept of human rights as a core concept is a result of this power balance at that time, because a Chinese delegate proposed a different concept. It's a Confucian concept, and that if we translate it into English, it's probably called empathy or human compassion. And Chinese people believe that that could be the kind of foundational concept of this entire universal legal concept. But of course, in that time, 1950, 40, in political power and economic power is very much in this in the side of the Western countries, so-called. So therefore, this concept of human rights has prevailed. So this is really very much interesting, and this argument. And I don't know whether it is really a kind of justifiable in the purely theoretically, but the idea of this, not idea, the concept of this human rights as such is also now being challenged and contested in different parts of the world. And so I think we must really take into account this emerging trend, not against human rights, but revisiting the origin of human rights and trying to make it much more universal. And then in this sense, as I think Professor Gale has been trying to do, we must really go beyond in a kind of one small, not so small, but one in a culture framework. And then how we can really find out in a mutually understandable new horizon or framework is a big challenge.
Thank you, Hiko. It's so interesting. I love that idea of the Confucian concept of empathy and human compassion. How beautiful. And echoing, I think, Rowan Williams's idea of holding others in loving attention. So we find already within two approaches, very different approaches, perhaps in many other respects, but in this respect, they have that idea that would support a concept of rights that is far more communal in its approach. I think actually on this whole idea of, human rights and what do human rights cover, Jeremy Waldron has something really interesting to say. He's very clear about the distinction between moral rights and human rights. And of course, it's like the Venn diagram. We might have a huge number of moral rights that don't necessarily get written into human rights. We could say very early on, we saw the civil and political rights were given priority after World War II. We saw them given priority in international and many national legal systems for various historic reasons. But actually, one could have argued at that point that the right to food and the right to shelter should have been absolutely at the top of that list, and everybody should have enshrined them into law. So that might be our number one moral right. We could have a whole other argument about what we'd put top of the priority of moral rights, but let's just say for the sake of argument that we would say that was coming first in our moral rights. But of course, that wasn't written in terms of legal norms into national constitutional systems, because it's not something that all countries would commit to guaranteeing for their citizens. And so what we see is this distinction, and I think sometimes the language and also the theological language or the religious language around rights can blur that distinction, particularly in its theoretical underpinnings. It jumps between what rights ought to be, and this idea around moral rights, and actually what we're writing into law as legal rights. And human rights, when we talk about them, I think and when we talk about the concept of universality, we are talking about legal norms that protect society. So what we might, and then we give them a kind of an enhanced position within our legal framework. So within a constitution, they'll either be entrenched or they're given special protection, and they can trump other claims in law. And so when we're expanding those concepts, so we see, for example, already there are moves to the right to sustainable environment, and all the rights that come with that into a form of hard law, tangible law. And we see a lot of academic dialogue and a lot of conversation about animal rights, for example. And we can, I think, without calling them human rights, we can actually make them rights that have a priority as legal norms within our legal frameworks. So we could give them equal standing if we chose to, because they are equally as important. I think human rights pertain to human beings, and we can also relate, for example, the environment to human beings, because we can say, well, humans need a sustained environment where they can flourish. So again, we can argue for that from that theoretical basis, that a sustainable environment is actually a human right as much as it's a right for the world to have an environment that is sustainable. What we of course get when we get into human rights that we might give priority to, but might sit outside the idea of human rights, is legally we have to think about who is going to claim those rights, or who you have to appoint a guardian on behalf of an animal, or on behalf of the environment to start claiming it, those sorts of things. But I do think this distinction, I found it very helpful in my thinking to have this distinction in our mind, that there's a whole tranche of what we would call essential rights, rights that are essential to human flourishing, that don't necessarily find the right level of protection in law, because we don't, within our particular societies, or universally within societies, give them the priority that they might want to have. And that's the nature of politics and governance compared to the kind of oughts. And I think that's where pluralism in particular comes in, because our communities, whether they're religious or not, can choose to prioritize those moral rights. So a community might decide that it's going to feed everyone within its area, if you like. They might decide the right to food, or they might shelter people. We've seen that from the reaction to the war in Ukraine. We've seen people give up homes or welcome people into their homes, So for them, the right to food and shelter, that's kind of a grassroots, everybody deserves the right to food and shelter approach. Gosh, wouldn't the world look a different place if we did that globally?
Caroline, you are muted.
No, I still can't hear you.
I cannot hear you.
Maybe your headphones.
Professor Morita, would you like to come back in on that point? My apologies for the...
No, it's okay. Yes, thank you very much. So this human rights, I think a distinction between this human rights and moral rights, probably in my vocabularies, and also in what Charles Taylor said, is this distinction between the two dimensions of human rights. One is a legal norm, and another one is philosophical foundation, philosophical justifications. And it's, I think, corresponding to in Professor Gale's distinction between this human rights in this legal norm and moral rights in general. Yeah. So I fully agree to these distinctions. And just I want to come back to the concept of this human, and how we can really find these foundations in the ethical foundations, which in a sense force us, also convince us to respect this kind of human rights as something that not in this we cannot take away from any human being. So in this sense, probably I may come back to this our initial conversations about the secular and the sacred. So we need certain kind of a sacred in the foundations, which might be not religious in this Western Christian's meanings, but still we need a much more powerful this justifications in ethical foundations. Probably I should put it in this ways, which really justify and support, in a sense, enforce us to follow, respect, and what the human rights asks us to do as a legal norm. And at this point, so this is my point, that this the human as a purely in a secular meaning doesn't, in my opinion, couldn't have such a power to persuade and enforce in us human to follow and respect human rights as a legal norm. So then, what kind of this ethical norm or ethical foundation can we imagine? So usually under this Christian, let's say in a European Christendom, we imagine it as something transcendental, beyond this immanent, also beyond in a secular environment. But we have a different cultural traditions or religious traditions, which do not have such a kind of dichotomies in a transcendent and immanent. And this dichotomy is very much peculiar in the Western culture. So my argument here is probably we need to bring up in a different, in a framework, a paradigm, I should say paradigm, that which has not such dichotomies, but still can be quite powerful enough to persuade and enforce us human to respect and follow human rights as a legal norm. So that's my kind of comment.
Maria, did you want to come back there?
Gosh, yeah, I think it's so interesting, and I'm sorry, I feel like I don't have necessarily the legal training to to kind of comment on the legal aspect of it, but from the point of view of this sacred and how and the immanent and transcendental sacred, that is very interesting indeed, and the link with rights and as I see it or as I think about it, justice and so on. It's fascinating. So it's making me rethink some of the topics of my research as I hear you both speak. I think that what I'm seeing in my research with climate activists is that there is almost an attempt, a kind of a struggle with the transcendental, let's say, because and of course there are kind of long-standing critiques about the fact that it is precisely this kind of belief in a kind of transcendental sacred that has led to the environmental crisis, or that the roots of the ecological crisis are, according to people like Lynn White Jr., found in the Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition, because it places humans at the center, it's anthropocentric, and because it's transcendental. So the earth is just a temporary home rather than kind of a permanent home, or it's just a temporary place. and the aspiration, the human aspiration is towards that. It's to transcend, right? Yeah, it's really interesting, because what I'm seeing in my research is that the Christian activists, for instance, the green Christian activists, they've been at the kind of the focus of my research for some years now, and they are still able to fully embrace the climate justice message by whilst maintaining this kind of, let's say, transcendental standpoint of kind of the earth is God's, so we don't have the right to abuse the earth, because the earth was created by God. So they have a kind of creation centered kind of or creation care angle, let's say, in their climate justice movement, in the particular Christian climate justice movement. Whereas the kind of, let's say, secular or even pagan activists, or activists coming from other traditions, will have a more immanent understanding of, that the earth is divine, the earth is sacred. We have to obviously protect the earth, because it not because of some transcendental power, or but because this is where the sacred is. So it's like I said, this discussion is really relevant to my research. And I think that, kind of going back to what Jessica said at the beginning about plurality, and kind of making, trying to find a way for all these voices to be heard, and what you both said about, compassion and, holding the other, in kind of a loving sort of understanding. I think that that's the only way to, be able to integrate all these different positions, because in a way, if we look at the concerns that climate activists have, whether they're Christians or secular, they are fighting for the same thing, and they are fighting for the rights of people to, people in the global South to live, and our future generations to thrive. So the end goal is the same, even though these frameworks are so different.
Thank you so much. Perhaps it's a good point to move on to the discussion of inherent dignity. But before that, just sort of point out that lots of scholars argue that human rights only emerged at a particular time in a particular context, and have a particular Christian background. But there are many points of connection between human rights and religion and belief traditions. And as we've heard with Professor Morita mentioning the empathy and human compassion element, and we also have inherent dignity as in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The preamble explains that recognition of inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And in Rowan Williams's lectures, he set out a particular understanding of dignity. And perhaps we could explore what is meant by inherent dignity and discuss that concept in some detail. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this the wonderful also another questions in inherent dignities, and this dignity, the also once again has become quite a contestable concept. And for instance, I don't know whether it is quite well known, but we had the book which is titled, I think, what is the challenge to I think Eastern challenge to the concept of human rights. And within this book, in Charles Taylor's, once again, the Canadian, he's of course a contemporary Canadian philosopher. He argues that dignity has also some kind of a Eurocentric concept. Therefore, there's some kind of not bias, but so it's already certain kind of culture in this assumptions within it. So therefore, it's questionable, probably not impossible, but it's questionable whether this concept can be a basis or a foundation of this human rights. That's some kind of the argument also we have. And and of course, in this, for instance, in China, there are some scholars, Chinese scholars, they are trying to find out certain kind of philosophical resources, materials, which can really justify in a concept of dignity on their own unique ways. So in this sense, it's not, as I said, it's not completely impossible, and it's not quite not completely unacceptable to explore and to seek this multiple foundations of multiple probably in justifications of, or some probably in the interpretations of the concept of dignity from multiple perspectives. So that's probably, yeah, I stop here.
Maria, did you want to go next, or do you want me to?
No, I'd like you to go next. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I think I would start the discussion back at the point where, when we're talking about the theory of rights, we're talking about in the theory of human rights, we're talking about the legal norms that we choose to prioritize in society. And Maria, thank you. Thank you for your understandings that you're bringing. This is by no means a lawyer's discussion. And I apologise if I've made it such because of my background. But when we're looking at those theories, we are looking at the idea of which norms we protect as superior norms in society and how we justify that theoretically. And the idea of human rights and the idea of human dignity comes in, I think, because of a concern that there is a role that humans play within society, and an extent to which humans should be protected within societies, certainly against this massive oppression that we can sometimes see by a nation state or by others in society. But the flip side of that we don't really talk about enough, and as a biblical concept, for example, if we're saying, well, we perceive as humans having some particular role in our organization of society, what we don't talk about enough, and what is definitely a concept within theological terms that comes into it, is this idea of stewardship. So if someone, and we can see that perhaps most clearly in ideas of governance, if we put someone into government, whether that's national government or international government, we see that as a responsibility, not just as a privilege, or not just as a manipulation of power, if you like. And I think the same really goes with human rights. If we say that there are human rights pertaining to being human, and we can justify that around human dignity, we say humans have a particular dignity, that's not to say the environment doesn't have a particular dignity, and certainly a particular beauty. We only need to look around us at some of the breathtaking world that we have to say there is a dignity in that as well. It might not be human dignity, but it is a dignity and it is a beauty. But what we're saying with human rights is, within our structures, we are saying that there's something about human being and human governance, but absolutely what comes alongside with that is the idea of stewardship. And that, from a theological perspective, goes hand in hand. But that also, I think, from a legal perspective or from a political perspective, goes hand in hand as well. And a lot of political theory will argue, actually, that at the point where an individual who is in a position of authority starts to behave in ways that are particularly go against human flourishing, or that would give justification for an uprising against that form of governance. That's what we see in some of the literature. So I would see that. I mean, I wouldn't. Maria, you mentioned the way in which sometimes the Judeo-Christian tradition has been blamed in respect of some of the climate crisis. Actually, so if we understand fossil fuels and that aspect have the greatest impact, it is those societies and cultures that are heavily dependent on those fossil fuels and are producing them. So I think the blame doesn't necessarily lie at the floor of a particular Christian or religious community, but certainly particular cultures, I would say. And then, but if we bring that back then into the discussion around human dignity and the flip side of that, stewardship, and how that all relates, I would argue that stewardship, just as community in rights needs to be emphasized more, I think stewardship does as well. And I would very much argue that that is a theological concept, but not just a theological concept, but where we would find a meeting of the minds, both in various religious traditions and in those non-transcendental approaches. But I think also, I love Akihiko's idea and approaches to this thinking where we don't have to be so bivalent. We don't have to be so, well, it's the non-transcendental and the transcendental. I think there is a point, particularly within discussions around the climate, where we do converge around this idea that there is something so precious about this world that needs protecting, whether we call that a human right or whether we call that a right of absolute priority, a superior legal norm. We could find a legal term that would probably satisfy the multivalent approach we might find in our reasoning.
I just have a comment to this, because on one hand, just coming back to this criticism that has been leveled at the Judeo-Christian tradition about the fact that it's anthropocentric, it puts humans at the center and so on, and that the ecological crisis has roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Let's say, antithetical position to that is that, so the Lynn White critic is that of, one position is a biblical scholar called Naum Sarna, who talks about the fact that, in the biblical story, in the story of creation, we also have, it's not really about an anthropocentric stand, but it's about recovering a human, it's kind of for the first time in a way proposing a kind of human dignity, because he says it's about we have to see this story in relationship with other stories of creation, where humans would have been at the whim of the gods, and they wouldn't have had the kind of the right to have almost a contract, a relationship with the divine. So that kind of personal relationship with the divine, that is a kind of it's about human dignity, and so I just wanted to kind of relate that to our discussion. That absolutely, I can see how this links with ideas of stewardship as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also probably I can firstly, really, I fully agree with what you said, and also what Professor Gale mentioned with regard to this relationship between the human dignity and the stewardship. And what something came into my mind while listening to your conversation is that that's also something that Charles Taylor quite in detail elaborated in his works, so which is in this modernizations also changed this entire kind of a theoretical, well, not theoretical only, but some kind of a paradigm of so-called Judeo-Christian traditions in the West. And before this, the pre-modern societies in a human, yes, human has dignities, but the human dignity is not supreme. Of course, because like other entities, they are all creatures, creation of God, and therefore, they should follow this. Also, they should really remember that kind of divine the divine purpose of the God's creations. So therefore, under this some kind of religious the orders, the human is of course should considered as some something really must be respected, but it's not replaced God, of course. But through these modernizations, this is also something Jack Moulton also clearly criticized, that through this modernization progress in a human reason, they has gradually replaced what God occupied in the pre-modern Western societies. And that's something that's of course has to do with the distinction with the secularism and also this sacred. And that's something probably we can revisit. And I happen to find out is that, for instance, even in the Western intellectual histories, we have different interpretations of these Christian traditions, like previously I mentioned. For instance, Giordano Bruno is one example, and he's this pantheismic interpretation of Christianity. It was not accepted at that time, but it's also possible in this another kind of interpretation of this Judeo Christian tradition. And interestingly, his interpretation could be compatible with a non-Western, like in East Asian, this worldview or view of humans more easily. So even in this Western traditions, there are many different kind of currents or streams that we can really revisit and probably revive and reuse it in order to enrich this the own traditions, so that it can become much more broader and probably being able to embrace the different views which exist in different parts of the world. That's
Maria, did you want to come in there?
No, I just just took in what Akihoko said. No, I don't have any comments.
Yeah, so I do so agree. Akihiko and I find ourselves always in our discussions coming to a point where we agree with each other. And as I say, even though our starting points are different, and I think so on the point that when we have discussions, particularly I think in our Western approaches, we can sometimes better take a step back and think about ultimate authorities or ultimate hierarchies, or and we see, for example, and I think we have a meeting point, certainly from my own theological perspective, that there is an ultimate authority that doesn't sit with humankind. And this gives us, and for some people it would be the divine, for others there is an authority that sits outside that, or even norms or governing impulses or ideas, which would not necessarily, it would give humankind a position in governance and within global society, within national society. But there is the idea that that's not the be all and the end all. And so for those from me, from a theological perspective, it's ideas of the divine. But I think also, Maria, as we think about ideas around the climate and sustainability, there is this idea of interdependence. You know, we are interdependent for our very existence on the environment, for our food, for our breathing, for all of that. And I've been interestingly looking recently at some ideas around space exploration and human rights and theology and the right to freedom of religion. And that actually can give us a very interesting insight when we look at environments which are not for us, don't provide a sustainable environment for us to survive as human beings. And when we look at some of these pictures that come back from satellites, and we look at that from another outside worldly perspective, we can understand so much more clearly this interdependence that we have. So yes, I think the theoretical approach to human rights and this idea of why we call them human and what we mean by human dignity helps us to step back and think actually human dignity is involved with this, deeply involved with this interdependence with the environment around us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead. Yeah, no, I was just, yeah, that's exactly how I understand it, that, you know, this, in a way, ecological understanding or interdependent understanding, as you put it, you know, it's absolutely key to, you know, to thinking about human rights, and I think that this is what, in a way, it's exciting about this kind of more almost you know, community-oriented view of human rights. You know, community as in human and non-human, you know, environmental community, because you know, we see this all the time, you know, in the way, for instance, you know, that let's say, you know, certain environments are exploited for, you know, the extraction of rare earths in the global south, for instance. You know, these affect their, you know, very existence, the water, the, you know, the you know, environment they live in, they, you know, and we see this with climate change, of course, a lot. You know, the fact that you know, people in the you know, increasingly, I mean, of course, we have environmental and climate migrants in the global north as well, but you know, in the global south, people are faced with you know, the choice to either adapt to the effects of climate change or migrate. And you know, that there are obviously increased conflicts in, you know, many regions because of that. And you know, there, you know, we know that these conflicts are really, you know, the roots of the conflicts are you know, climatic changes. So in a way, yeah, this more ecological view will allow us to think you know, more deeply about human rights and respecting human rights in this way of kind of thinking about their environments, people's environment as well, you know, that are absolutely essential for their flourishing.
Yeah, I fully agree with you in this ecological view should be taken much more seriously when we talk about this human rights. Yeah, that's quite a well, I think it's a really quite important in a point. And also, I fully agree with this Professor Gale that we must take the one step back and look at the how we are made. In fact, we have been made the earth what we are now. And in this sense, just I want to share also another kind of insight that I have also quite recently found in my study about this Christian histories in let's say in Judeo-Christian traditions, which is that yes, in the legally speaking, okay, let me start with the legally discussions in that this Western jurisprudence in a distinction between human and things, which is respectively corresponding to a persona and also a res, the RES, in ancient Rome. And of course, this distinction was introduced, in a sense, it was incorporated through this convergence of this the ancient Greek cultures with this ancient Christianities. But Charles Taylor, not only Charles Taylor, many in theologians and also this Catholic scholars, and they more or less agree that this synthesis of this ancient in this Greek philosophies, this distinction between this immaterial and bodily, and in the ancient Christians, not the distinction, but anyway, two expression, either flesh and spirit, the unfortunately combined, and it's created in a kind of a source of tensions in the next kind of 2,000 years up to now, and it's mostly represented by Descartes. Then afterwards, it's affected our way of thinking, and of course, Western culture in the Western civilizations has spread out to the all over the world. Then it's also framed our way of thinking. And what some scholars in the philosophers, contemporary philosophers are trying to do is to revisit this most fundamental in this frame of thinking paradigm, and trying to revisit, and probably come up with a much more more culturally and much probably more theologically, more this universal paradigms. That's something most, I think, some very leading scholars and philosophers that are working on that. So probably we need to also take into account this kind of insight when we talk about this human rights.
Thank you, Akihiko. Yes, and how important, so important, I think, to really go back and question those very foundations, and not just question, but listen. So listen to these other philosophers and hear what they're saying and where their understanding's coming from. We are in such a period of looking at history and decolonizing, as it were, and we don't want to go round that circle again and sort of take this colonial Western approach to rights, when actually it's about creating legal norms that fit into cultures. And while there is an aspect of universality that we might see as essential to this idea of being human and to the idea of human dignity, we can learn so much from each other, and I think unlearn as well. There's so much we can unlearn. And I just, there's a really interesting dialogue, I think, that occurs and has been occurring, and I hope will continue to occur between some Christian philosophers of rights, if you like, or theologians of rights, and the O'Donovans in particular. Joan Lockwood O'Donovan looks very much at the idea of the concept of rights. What do we mean about rights? And Rowan Williams brings this up, and they look at more at duties, and Rowan Williams looks more at communities and responsibilities. And I think why I like Rowan Williams's approach is he seeks to save the concept of universalism. So he succeeds, I think, this approach which looks at the community, looks at other approaches. I think in my approach, I take it even further and look at a dialogue as essential and vital to this, particularly to do that listening. So my idea is that you can't categorically say, this is how we justify an approach, and it is the right way. To me, when we come with our cultures, we have to have an idea, our cultural approach, we have to have an idea about what might be universally applicable as universal norms, but also within our cultures, what works with that development through history in the way that we publicly live together.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, at the point where we have to listen to different approaches,
Yeah.
and be clear in our own approaches. And mine is clearly theological, but also be able and open in that dialogue to a point where we say there's sufficient consensus here to create a universal norm that we think is applicable for all humankind, but also for the globe, for the interaction we have with the globe, because we've had a climate focus here. And I do think that's particularly important. I am aware that that then throws me open, certainly in my work, to this idea of this embedding in culture, so that we might lose a universality. But my view is that we shouldn't be afraid of difference. You know, difference is a good thing. And it's just that we need to converge at some point to create those legal norms that are universally applicable in terms of international law, but also that work within society and have a level of protection, particularly when we're talking about human rights for minorities within national cultures. I'm conscious of time, Caroline. We have talked our way through the time we have. We've probably got time for one more brief discussion, have we, before we come to? I could talk all morning with you, but I'm conscious of the time. What do you think, Caroline? Do we have time?
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And yes, thanks, Jessica. You've helpfully moved us on to the final question that we were hoping to explore today, which is this notion of balancing rights with responsibilities. And in mentioning Rowan Williams's lecture, where he suggests that service of our neighbour is an aspect of our own right. And perhaps we could explore the question of whether it is possible to move beyond the notion of simply balancing rights with responsibility to the notion that service of our neighbours is an aspect of our own right without a theological basis. So is that possible? Perhaps we could explore that briefly in the time we have remaining. Thank you.
Yeah, probably it can be, well, I think it can be called in a, well, just, you know, in a, if I take the risk of overgeneralizations, it may be called in as a communitarian approach to the human rights, which means that this human rights shouldn't be in an individualistic concept. It should be based on this community, because a human is a social being. That's, I think, fundamental ideas, and that nobody, I think, shouldn't or couldn't deny these propositions. But the question is, then usually in these opponents argue that this kind of group or community-oriented rights justifications sometimes really support this majorities in tyrannies, the over minority. And so that's once again, this is balance. It's in a practical levels, but at the same time, also the theoretical levels, I think there's some space that we really need to think about and discuss in order to find out probably in a more rigorous this argument, which can really justify the Lord Williams' argument. His argument is completely right, and but also there are some risks. So then we must probably need to work a little bit on that.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Nita, would you like to make some comments on that point? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking now that one concept that I think could help here would be that of ecological citizenship. And it's just it just occurred to me that there have been, this is a new concept, it's been around for some 20 years. And many scholars have tried to define what it means, to be an ecological citizen. And some definitions of ecological citizenship include dimension or finding different dimensions to what it means to be an ecological citizen. And one, and I was just trying to remember the scholars who came up with this scale. they kind of found 4 dimensions, and these are rights, responsibilities, sustainability, and participation. And I just, it just occurred to me that, from this point of view of kind of balancing rights and responsibilities, this concept of ecological citizenship might help, because, in a way, we are kind of global citizens. We are no longer just responsible for our, community, but or polity, or we suddenly have this global responsibility, and we suddenly, we feel that we have this global responsibility. I think when we watch the news, and like you mentioned, or the war in Ukraine was mentioned, and the fact that so many global efforts were emerged to kind of try and support that, so the victims, so it's really interesting. I think that it kind of, in thinking about rights and responsibility, we also think about the kind of relationships that we have, the relationships we have with our communities, and the fact that we increasingly live in this global world, and we are aware of this ecological relationships that we have, and interdependence, as Jessica said. So I think I would argue that this concept of ecological citizenship could also help us discuss this relationship between our rights and responsibilities.
Thank you so
Absolutely
much.
super. Sorry, Caroline, you were going to go.
I was just going to ask you, Jessica, if you'd like to come in with a final comment before I draw our discussion to a close.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, so I love the idea of ecological citizenship. Yes, so such a fantastic one. And I think that brings in this idea of stewardship, although I would probably articulate it as well. And I think very much in terms of, Akihiko, you're mentioning risk. There is, of course, risk to community in that the individual gets lost, and the individual's rights and protection of the individual is lost. And again, that's where I would fully support Rowan Williams's approach, because he calls to mind the need to balance that, the individual right and individual flourishing, as well as the right for and responsibilities towards the community. So yeah, I think really, really important from both perspectives. So my final thought, I think, would be this idea of privilege, not just stewardship, but the privilege we have to be in the environment and in the communities that we're in, and that it's a different way of thinking than this approach to claim rights and my rights, as it were. So this idea of stewardship, this idea of community and individual flourishing held in tension, and understanding the culture within which that has to situate itself is an important one.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful contributions, and we've had a fascinating and very wide-ranging discussion. So to draw out just a few of the topics that we've covered: universality of human rights, the language of human rights, mentioned the role of the sacred, the meaning of secularism, and the understanding of the other. Then moving on to extending rights beyond human communities, we've touched on artificial intelligence, animal rights, and rights relating to the environment, and recognizing our independence with the environment in which we live. We've also explored human dignity and the notion of balancing rights with responsibilities, the importance of seeing ourselves as a social being, and the concept of ecological citizenship. So thank you so much for your contributions. It really has been a brilliant discussion, and I very much enjoyed listening to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.